Hello, everybody. Um, my name is Dana Howard, and I'm an assistant professor in the Center for Bioethics in the College of Medicine, and also the philosophy department at The Ohio State University. Welcome to the Center for Ethics and Human Values Monthly CARE panel, conversation about research ethics. The CARE program aims to support Ohio State's shared values in the domain of research by building community around discussions related to research integrity. And it's presented with the support from the OSUMC Center for Bioethics and the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, CTSI. We are so happy to have you all here. And today we're going to be talking about balancing risks and benefits when it comes to research. So researchers are always told that they have to carefully balance possible risks against expected benefits to ensure ethical study design. Much has been discussed about how to determine the risks of research participation, and there's a lot of guidelines about how to do that, and whether there are any limits to how risky research can be. But less explored is how we should really understand the prospect of benefit. And so we're going to be talking about both of these questions and how to really negotiate this balance today. And I'm so excited to be joined today with the following panelists. We have Erin Segal, who's an assistant professor of bioethics at Kansas City University. Erin's work concerns the ethics of medical research with human subjects, and specifically the benefits and burdens of participating in medical research. And he's focused on issues concerning risk, social value, compensation, and altruism. We also have Dr. Megan Roberts, who's an associate professor of health and behavior and health promotion at Ohio State University. Dr. Roberts' research focuses on tobacco use amongst historically marginalized populations, particularly adolescents and young adults, racial and ethnic minorities, and individuals living in rural areas. So welcome to the two of you. The way we're going to be structuring the panel is we're going to begin with Erin as an outside panelist to really set the sort of framework and think through some of these issues and how you've been thinking about it. And then Megan, you're going to have a chance to introduce your own work and how you've been thinking about it as a researcher and a practitioner and how you've been navigating these ethical challenges. I have some preset questions that we're going to sort of use to start off the conversation. And then for all the participants coming in virtually, if you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. Feel free to start asking questions whenever. We're going to have a lot of time at the end to just field questions from you as well. So to no further ado, why don't we start with Erin and your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dana, for inviting me here, and thanks to all of you for coming to this really interesting discussion that I'm really looking forward to. So right, so as Dana said, a lot of my work is on how to understand risks and benefits and their relation in clinical research, and specifically questions about some questions having to do with the kinds of risks and the amount of risk that we can permissibly expose participants to, especially when we think about different types of participants, pediatric versus consenting adults versus other adults, and then questions about what types of benefits can justify what types of risks across different contexts. I think there's some things that we can hold fixed across most types of research and saying that here's a type of benefit that can justify this type of risk, and sometimes we need to make more fine-grained distinctions there. I think this is a really interesting area because there are a couple different things that we need to, I don't know, pay attention to or be sensitive to. So there are research regulations and guidelines on the one hand, sort of often in line with them, but somewhat differently. There's current practice. And then finally, there's sort of the underlying morality of risk. And I think it's really important if we're going to answer these sorts of questions about risks and benefits to, I don't know, not ignore any of these different areas. I think they're all necessary, but sometimes it can be really difficult to put them in conversation with one another. Also, interestingly, in this context, I think that most of the U.S. federal regulations and a lot of the big research guidelines do a pretty good job of understanding the pertinent moral considerations that are relevant to risks and benefits across different populations. So, the federal regulations say that children are owed significantly greater protections than consenting adults, and accordingly, there are sort of much lower limits on the net risks that they can be exposed to. Um, I think the issue a lot of the time with the federal regulations and sort of the related guidelines are that they just are sort of silent on a number of really important questions. So I think there's not very much that they get straightforwardly wrong. It's just there's a lot that um, they just don't say very much about. So, for instance, the federal regulations don't say anything about the maximum limits on net research risks that consenting adults can be exposed to. So I've tried to think about how to understand those in different types of research, but the regulations themselves are just sort of silent. And then what I'll talk a little bit more about today is the regulations are also silent on what exactly a prospect of benefit is in the context of pediatric research. So I think the regulations say something about the different avenues toward ethically enrolling children in research, but don't always put that much meat on the bone in terms of the exact conditions that must be met in order for enrolling children to be ethical. Um, so yeah, I think I want to say a little bit more about the prospect of benefit in pediatric research. The last thing I'll say before that is, in terms of my approach to these sorts of questions, there is sort of like a tightrope that I think needs to be walked, and that's that one, I think it's important that we ground what we have to say about risks and benefits in some sort of more general claims about the morality of risk and the kinds of protections that different people are owed from risk, while also being sensitive to uh, morally important differences between different types of research. And so I think there are sort of two mistakes that we can make. One is just to stay at this really general level and accidentally assume that different kinds of research will work differently in terms of what benefits can justify which risks. The other is to sort of stick with one or another specific type of research and then be sort of too hasty to generalize from it and think that all other types are going to work like it. So that's sort of the tightrope act that I'm trying to walk. Um, but yeah, let me share some slides from a sort of an ongoing project that I'm working on. Yeah, on the prospect of direct benefit in pediatric research. Okay, and hopefully you can see that now. Okay. So, right, this is a project that I'm sort of currently working on. And just a disclaimer, some of the work on this was done while I was at the NIH, but the views expressed here are my own. Okay, so in general, the federal regulations say this is followed in current practice. There's sort of two main ways of ethically enrolling children in research, or two different types of studies. So one are studies where the risks themselves are sufficiently low. In particular, they're said to be minimal or sometimes a minor increase over minimal risks. The other way that it can be acceptable to enroll children in research is if participating would provide people with the prospect of direct benefit. I'll just call these prospect of direct benefit studies, PDB studies. I have it on the slide. Um, and one thing to note is when we're talking about direct benefits here, I think we're already really starting to restrict what kinds of benefits we're going to be talking about, because at least the way that I tend to think about benefits, there's a really wide range of things that could be reasonably considered a benefit to someone or another. But when we're talking about the prospect of direct benefit, we're talking about a more restricted set of benefits, namely they're benefits to the participants themselves rather than to other people. They are medical or health benefits rather than other types of benefits like helping them pursue their values or getting financial compensation. And they're benefits that are the result of the intervention being studied, rather than these sort of ancillary benefits or inclusion benefits that people get just by being in the trial, not as a result of the intervention. Um, okay, so we've got these two general tracks for ethically enrolling children in research, and the federal regulations are quite clear on um, when a study has minimal risks, or at least relatively clear. The thought is that minimal risks are risks that are no more severe than the risks that children encounter in everyday life. And we can gather some examples of what we think those are. We can measure the amount of risk, and then we can compare those, at least in when we have enough data, to experimental interventions. And we can say, okay, here the risks of participating in some study are no greater than the risks that children would face in everyday life. So the regulations and related guidelines have something pretty specific to say about this first type of research. But by contrast, the regulations say very little about what it means for a study to offer participants the prospect of direct benefit. And there's considerable disagreement in the bioethics literature about when exactly a study offers the prospect of direct benefit. So I'm going to say a little bit about the proposals that we can find in the literature. I'm going to suggest that none of them work very well, and I'm going to try and sketch something that I think works a bit better. So here's sort of the three big views of what a prospect of direct benefit is in the literature here. The first is this idea that a prospect of direct benefit just means there's a possibility that people will benefit by being in the trial, where possibility just means something like a non-zero probability. Now, I think this is a really intuitive sense of the word prospect. It is one way we use that term, and I think it has the benefit that it can, for some types of research, it can expand access to clinical trials for participants with really poor alternatives. I think that's at least in some cases a good thing. Um, but I don't think ultimately this is going to be a very plausible understanding of prospective direct benefit, because, for instance, we're going to have early phase studies where there's essentially no evidence that they actually will benefit the people enrolled in the studies. So we shouldn't call those prospective direct benefit studies if there's a very, very low chance that participants are actually going to benefit. So this view is, I think, sort of too inclusive in a lot of ways. In response, some people sort of go the other direction, right? They say a prospect of benefit is we're looking for some degree higher and more defined, that we have more evidence, a higher probability of benefit, because we want to be sure that people are actually going to, not if not in every case, at least in a lot of cases, they're going to benefit from being in the study. And I think this does a good job of protecting against those kinds of cases that I was mentioning are difficult for the possibility of benefit view. Um, However, I think this is actually going to be too restrictive, right? So there are going to be cases where, again, consider early phase research, but for individuals with really poor alternatives, say pediatric cancer patients where the cancer has not been adequately treated by the other available therapies on offer. If we've got a lowish probability of participating in a clinical trial actually being beneficial, say a 5% chance, 10% chance, or we're going to think that's really low in the grand scheme of things, but that may actually be high enough to be reasonable if the other alternatives are very, very poor. And so if we set this probability threshold much higher, we're going to say that those views aren't going to count as prospective benefit studies. And so if they have more than minimal risks, we're going to say then it wouldn't be ethical to enroll children in them, even though I think there's sort of cases in which it could clearly be beneficial, at least depending on how the children and their parents are thinking about the risks and benefits. The final view we find in the literature is this sort of reasonable person standard or reasonable parent standard. And it says a study offers the prospect of direct benefit just in case a reasonable parent acting in the best interests of their children would choose, they would consider the expected benefits to justify enrolling their child in the research. Now, I think in a way there is some truth to this. What we want are cases where the expected benefits do, in to a reasonable person seem to justify the risks. But I think there are a handful of issues with this as a proposal for what prospective direct benefit research is understood in terms of. Because for one thing, reasonable parents have very different attitudes towards what benefits can justify what risks. Um, Second, I think this provides very little guidance to IRBs in terms of how they're supposed to reason about whether a given study does provide the prospect of direct benefit. And finally, I think there's a real threat of circularity here with this view, just because I think reasonable parents are partly going to deliberate and choose in light of whether or not participating in a study would provide the prospect of direct benefit. So if that's right, then we can't understand what the prospect of direct benefit is in terms of this reasonable parent standard. So that was sort of a much too quick discussion of each of these, but basically, I don't think any of these views of prospective direct benefit um, are going to be very helpful in understanding what this category of research is sort of all about and how we should understand it. Um, I think in order to make more progress, the thing that's helpful is to think about why we care about prospective direct benefit research in the first place, what this category of research is for. Namely, um, I think we care about prospective direct benefit research because it's got a particular risk benefit profile. It's the kind of research where, although there are greater than minimal risks, or at least there can be, those can be justified by the expected benefits of participating. We say, because we're saying that it's only acceptable to enroll children in research with greater than minimal risks if there's also the prospect of direct benefit. So the prospect of direct benefit should be whatever exactly is going to justify greater than minimal risks. And if that's right, then in order to understand what a prospect of direct benefit is, then we can just sort of ask a slightly different question, and in a way, a slightly more basic question. Namely, what sorts of benefits, what sorts of considerations can justify exposing children to greater than minimal risks in research? And here I think there are a few more concrete things that we can say. So for one thing, I think we can say that the expected benefit itself is going to be one of the things that's relevant to when greater than minimal risks can be justifiable for children. So this will include, of course, the probability that they're going to derive some benefit from the intervention, the magnitude of that benefit if it occurs, and also the duration of that benefit, just because one that's going to last for a very long time is sort of worth a lot more than one that's going to last for a month, say. So this is, I think, sort of the most straightforward thing to say, and that's we look at the expected benefit of participating in the trial. That's the first thing we look to say, are these greater than minimal risks justifiable for children? But I think there are some other things that we can also look to and should also look to in asking whether these risks are justifiable. So for one thing, I think there's in different studies, we have very different levels of sort of quality of the evidence regarding our estimation of the expected benefit. That's because in different types of research, we use very different, sort of background evidence to guide the research and also to estimate how likely we think it might be that participants will benefit. So for instance, in some cases, we might have clinical data from adults that is very much relevant to estimating benefit in children because there's a high degree of relevance. And so this, the pediatric extrapolation is relatively straightforward. In other kinds of cases, we might only have in vitro models or simulation data that provides, in general, much weaker evidence in terms of estimating how likely it is that participants in a trial are going to benefit. And the thought here is when we've got much better evidence that the participants in a trial are going to benefit from being in it, that makes it easier to justify the risks of being in that trial. Versus if we have, if there's a chance that participants are going to benefit, but that's based on very, very poor quality evidence, that makes it a lot harder to justify the risks of being in that trial. This is, I'll note, one area where the federal regulations don't say very much. So in the common rule says essentially nothing about what kind of evidence we look for in estimating prospective benefit. The FDA does have some helpful guidance but pretty much the extent of what they say is the level of evidence that we need to look for is a much lower bar than the level of evidence we want to demonstrate efficacy. Because for that, we want a much higher bar. That's the sort of evidence we look for in order for the FDA to approve a drug or other intervention. And the kind of evidence we look for to say that a study has the prospect of benefit is lower. That seems true, but I think that glosses over a huge range of differences in terms of the kind of evidence that we actually have on offer and can bring to bear on whether or not participating in a study would offer the prospect of benefit. And the final thing I think we should look at is just the alternatives to participation. The thought just being here, if some potential participant has really great alternatives to participation, alternatives that have relatively good that are relatively good in terms of the benefits and relatively safe in terms of the risks, then it'll be much harder to justify the risks of enrolling in the trial versus if the alternatives are really poor, say they've exhausted their other main clinical alternatives, then a given set of risks will be more easily justifiable in the context of study participation. So I think each of these is something to weigh in terms of an overall estimation of whether participating in a study has the prospect of benefit in the sense that greater than minimal risks are justifiable. We should look at not only expected benefit, but also the quality of the evidence that we're using and the alternatives to participation. Okay, now I think there's a really interesting issue that this sort of risk-benefit way of analyzing what a prospect of benefit is. There's an interesting issue that I think this shed some light on and suggests that a lot of people are sort of I don't know, I don't want to say just straight up wrong about, but are sort of missing something. Um, and that is this question of whether the trial design or the researcher's intent matter for whether a study can count as offering the prospect of benefit. So one thing we find both in the literature and sort of among at least some researchers is this thought that in order for a study to provide the prospect of benefit, researchers need to intend for the trial participation to benefit the people in it, or the study has to be designed to evaluate clinical benefit. And so the thought is, especially in like phase 1 and phase 2 research, we're not going to have that. The trials aren't going to be evaluating clinical benefit. They're going to be evaluating safety and tolerability, things like that. And the thought is researchers aren't intending to benefit the people in the study. And so it's sort of a category mistake in some way for to call those studies ever prospective benefit studies. And what I want to say is, the trial design or the intentions that researchers happen to have is just a separate question from the risk-benefit profile of the study. Because the study can be early phase, not designed to evaluate benefit, and ones where researchers, of course, hope that people benefit from, but that's not the intention of the study. But still, because we have really great evidence, and it's evidence that weighs strongly in favor of a good chance of people benefiting from participation, I think can be reasonably thought of as prospective benefit studies. And there's sort of this related issue here of therapeutic misconceptions. Some people worry that if we say that early phase research provides people with the prospect of benefit, this could encourage therapeutic misconception because it could encourage people to think, I should expect that I or my child am going to benefit from being in the study. And to that, I just think that therapeutic misconception is not best addressed through, research classification, through different avenues, as sort of IRB avenues that the study gets approved through, but instead through how we conduct the consent process, how we describe the benefits, and say how we describe the probabilities that participants in a study are going to benefit. So I think whether or not we categorize research as prospect of benefit just surely is not the most effective way to combat therapeutic misconception, combat it though we should. And I sort of want to wrap up just by noting a couple of upshots for research regulations and research oversight. So I think one really good thing about understanding what the prospect of benefit in pediatric research means in terms of risks and benefits is that I think this is going to give a lot better guidance to researchers and IRBs, because it's asking them to do something that they are sort of trained and have the expertise to do. And this is to evaluate risks and benefits and how they relate to one another. By contrast, I think asking IRB members to think about, say, would a reasonable parent choose this? Well, different IRB members, say you've got an IRB where everyone themselves is a parent. You can pretty much guarantee that they're going to have very different parenting strategies. They're going to think very different things are reasonable. So we're just sort of encouraging a lot of disagreement. By contrast, if what we're asking IRB members to consider is what is the relation of risks and benefits, and is it such that the benefits, in context, given the evidence and the alternatives, outweigh the risks, this I think is precisely what IRBs are trained to do. And then the second big point is that I think this view is it's consistent with existing regulations. And not only consistent with, I think it sort of provides a pretty plausible way of reading the regulation. So I'll just briefly read this out. This is Code of Federal Regulations 46405, which is which is sort of the primary place where the common rule talks about approving prospect of direct benefit research. And it says that Health and Human Services will conduct or fund prospect of benefit research only if the IRB finds that the risk is justified by the anticipated benefit to the subjects. That relation of benefit to the risk is at least as favorable as the alternatives, and we've got the right provisions for assent of the children and permission of the parents or guardians. Now, I think what happens a lot of the time in the literature on prospect of direct benefit is people look for something further, some extra thing that we're trying to find, which is the prospect of benefit, something over and above the risk being justified by these anticipated benefits. And my thought here is just there is nothing really extra that we need to be looking for. What the prospect of direct benefit is just sort of a name that we give to research that has greater than minimal risks, but where the risks and the benefits stand in the right relation such that those benefits do justify the risks. Anyway, so I think this view not only sort of makes good conceptual sense at the level of the sort of underlying morality of risks and benefits, but also I think it allows beneficial research to go forward and is consistent with very sensible regulations that are already on hand. So that's everything I have for now. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for that overview and for sort of really thinking through the upshots of this clarification. Megan, why don't we have you just sort of introduce yourself, your work, and how you've been thinking about sort of negotiating potential risks and prospective benefit in your own research.
Great, thank you. And I think that was such a great overview. I'm slotted to speak for less time, which is perfect. I can just kind of supplement with a couple additional thoughts. Yeah, as Dana mentioned, I'm a social scientist, and I mostly do research related to tobacco use. Among populations who are often and historically targeted by tobacco industry. So that includes youth, it includes rural individuals, racial ethnic minorities, low income. So because most of my research is kind of more social science, surveys and things like that, there's often lower risk, although I'll talk a little more, not zero risk. Um, and so sometimes we weigh that with less benefit. I also want to just talk a little bit too about when you're working with, special communities, including communities that have been historically marginalized or even historically mistreated by the research community, that I think goes into how you weigh those risks. So, how do I and people I work with think about and weigh those risks and benefits? I do think IRB and common rules and all that are really helpful in providing good guidance for that. So like I said, our research is pretty low risk. So we generally do consider that the burden for benefit can be lower. That being said, there are risks. So, we ask minors about their tobacco use, so that can get them in trouble legally or with their parents or employers. We ask questions about sensitive topics that can be upsetting. So thinking about risk in terms of kind of what people generally encounter in their normal lives is usually a really good guidance. So if we're asking them about their mental health, or if we're asking them about experiences with discrimination, are those things that they're thinking about anyway in their normal life? That's a consideration. Some studies that I'm involved with do have people vaping in the lab or smoking cigarettes in the lab to look at kind of the health effects of that. So of course, we only have people who are already doing that, right? People who are already encountering those risks in their normal lives. We would never, ever be allowed or want to, do a study with, bring in people who are naive to nicotine and have them, vape in a laboratory. Uh, Also, some of the data collection we use has, mobile sensors or biosensors, so recording what people are doing in their daily life. Again, recording kind of what people might already be doing. Yes, they're going in and they're getting exposed to tobacco marketing when they go into a store, but that's a risk they're encountering anyway. So in terms of benefits, then current protocols are that payment cannot be considered a benefit. And I know we might talk about that a little bit more later. Is the experience itself a benefit? Ideally, yes, but realistically, no. And it really depends on the study as well as the individual. So some studies are just more interesting than others, right? I might do an interview study and we're talking about something that people are really excited about and interested in. I recently finished up a qualitative study where at the end people would say, wow, that was really interesting. Wow, that was, I really thought about some new ideas, or, young people. So they're giving me like heart emojis at the end. But not everybody. Some people like couldn't wait to be done, said as little as possible and got out the door, right? So there's individual differences in, I think, how much people benefit. And the studies themselves, some are more interesting than others, right? So qualitative was a fun study that we finished, but some people just are asked to do surveys, and that can be pretty boring. I wouldn't say harmful, but I would say it's, net zero in terms of benefit. One benefit you can consider is just learning about the research experience and learning about what research is like. That also is going to depend on the individual. If we're enrolling college students who are in degrees where there's research taking place, then maybe that's a benefit for them, learning more about what research looks like and getting more examples. But if that's not their career or not their degree, then maybe that would not be a benefit. For younger people, when we're enrolling, minors, and we're going through the assent process, that can be for some people very empowering, telling them about, these are your rights and you have the right to say no, even though your parents said yes. If you don't want to be in this study, you don't have to. If you don't want to answer any question, you can ask to skip it. So I think that itself can also be kind of an empowering experience, treating a 15, 16-year-old like an adult and giving them that authority. And then just a final consideration is just individual versus community benefit. A lot of the studies that we do might not help one person, or it might help them indirectly down the road. So a lot of what I do is meant to inform prevention programs and policy. So it might help them because a policy is going to help their community 10 years down the road. Or maybe it's a youth policy. So by the time that the policy comes into place, they're an adult and they're not enjoying the benefit, but maybe the next generation is. Or maybe kind of the same idea with clinical trials, right? Maybe this is contributing to a program of work where we're just monitoring right now, but that's going to help us know where we need to address issues later down the road. But when we're thinking about community benefits, we also have to think about community harm. So populations that have been historically mistreated by researchers, Tuskegee and all those very extreme cases. If we as researchers are coming into a community, collecting data and not benefiting at all, maybe, again, net zero, we're not doing harm, but are we now part of that system of using communities, writing our papers and getting our grants and benefiting, but not really helping that community enough. So I think that's where additional considerations can also come into play. Ideally, we would all be doing community-based participatory research, and we'd be really having the community be involved through the process. I think there are, great programs that also are meant to work on sharing back the information, and that can sometimes just be a small step when you're done with the study, recontacting all of your participants and providing them with information. We always have a study website where people can go back in and see what papers we published, and then also kind of lay explanations of what things are. So I think those are also kind of considerations that have to be weighed in. All right, I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Megan, and Aaron. That was really helpful in terms of just sort of both the theoretical framework, how the regulations, what they say, and also how we can read them. And Megan, I really appreciate really thinking through specifically the risks and benefits. And I'm going to get to one question that I have about that for the second question. But I want to sort of start off our conversation in some way it's summary, but also just sort of, I think it is the most fundamental question to get us started. Before I even jump into questions, I just want to say thank you for submitting questions already. If you haven't, but you have a question, please submit a question in the Q&A and we'll get to a lot of participant questions as well. So the most fundamental question that I was sort of thinking to get us started is, what sorts of benefits matter when it comes to research participation? So Megan, you were sort of listing all of these benefits, right? But community benefits as well as individual benefits, future benefits that may be indirect, even just the benefits of research participation itself. Those are all so fascinating, right? And one question that I have is should all of these types of benefits count, especially when we start thinking about the way in which Aaron was sort of saying, well, the prospect of direct benefit has to be in the context of, do these benefits justify exposing people to more than minimal risk, right, of research participation? So just opening the floor for just how should we think about the prospect of direct benefit? Should we understand that idea as expanded? And should certain possible benefits for research participation that you've already outlined actually not count when we're doing this sort of benefit risk balancing? So maybe Aaron, you could start, and then Megan, you could jump in.
Sure. No, and thanks, Megan, for the comments. Those are incredibly interesting and helpful. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, maybe this is a very philosopher way to think about benefits, because that's my background. But the way that I tend to think about it is in terms of what should count as a benefit for the purposes of ethically evaluating research. I tend to go for a very broad and permissive sense of what can count as a benefit, where things like at least in principle, compensation can absolutely be a benefit, and the things like curiosity about the scientific progress, wanting to gain knowledge, helping people to pursue their ends and their values. I want to say that in general, these can absolutely be benefits. And then the way that I tend to think about it anyway, um, there are a variety of sort of specific uses we put the idea of benefit to in ethically evaluating research. So one is making sure that studies have the right risk-benefit ratio. Another is making sure that studies have sufficient social value, because that's also about a different type of benefit. Another is making sure that it makes sense for the participants who you have to actually enroll in light of their life plans, their ends, their values. I think each of these has to do with benefits. And then with each of these dimensions, you then ask, which benefits should we be talking about? Which ones shouldn't we? So I think what I'm tempted to say for instance, about compensation is it's a benefit because it makes it more rational. It makes it make more sense for someone to enroll. But that doesn't mean we should factor it in risk-benefit analysis for pediatric populations. I think there are good reasons not to do that. But that doesn't mean that it's not a benefit in this broader sense. It just means that it's not one of the types of benefits we should consider in that narrower question. Yeah.
And Megan, I'm curious to hear from you also, like you mentioned all these potential benefits. Are there any benefits that you're like, that could be a benefit, but I don't think that it should count when you're thinking through the sort of weighing the risks and the benefits?
Yeah, yeah. I think, and when I write my IRB applications, I do not go through and list all of these like maybe situations. In fact, usually, if I'm just doing a plain, survey study, I'll say there are likely no benefits for participation in the study because I really can't, tell who and when and how people are going to benefit. But I think they're still really useful to consider, especially when designing your protocol, when running your study, because there are ways to make that study more beneficial or more likely to be beneficial for more people in very simple ways, explaining your process a little bit more so that they really understand and are learning about research or sharing back, as I said, sharing back the information. So those are things that don't have to be necessarily part of your equation when you're weighing, but just I think from an ethical standpoint can be still implemented.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love the idea of thinking about benefits on these different registers. And it's like, actually, it's really important to think about all these other possible benefits that may not count as a balancing because we want our research to be maximally beneficial to people, right? So even thinking about, the ways in which we can translate our research to our communities seems really important. Not necessarily to expose them to more risk, but because that's what doing good research is. So let me jump into another question. We're already getting some great questions in the chat. So I want to I'm actually going to jump into a chat question and then go back to some of the preset questions because we've started talking about incentives, but it would be nice to just sort of really think through how we should think about incentives or if we don't want to talk about incentives, compensation for research participation. So clearly it seems like that could be a benefit. It doesn't necessarily count in this balancing. But one of our participants asks, I would like to hear your thoughts on weighing incentives as benefits for populations who historically have greater barriers to participate in research. For example, mothers with childcare issues, people with transportation issues. How should we think about compensation or incentivizing research participation and how it relates to risks and benefits? Maybe Megan, do you want to start? And then Erin, you can join after.
Sure. So, yes, and I've definitely been a part of studies where we're trying to get people into the laboratory, and so transportation is provided. In those cases, I think it shouldn't even be counted as an incentive. It's just kind of what we need to make sure our research is being inclusive and that we're, reaching the populations we need and we're getting good representation. Um, yeah, it's very tricky. I think, Erin alluded, we don't want to have it be so weighted as a benefit that we're now being coercive and, paying people so much that, they're participating in studies because they feel like they can't say no. Um, but on the other hand, it absolutely is a benefit if you're working with individuals from, low income communities and you're giving them generous compensation for their time and, being mindful of insensitive to, their financial needs. Um, I would say for those individuals, it is definitely a benefit. It's probably the best thing about being in the study is the financial compensation. But I'll see I'm curious what Erin has to say.
And I'm very much in agreement. I think sometimes researchers and IRBs and bioethicists, maybe especially bioethicists, can feel uncomfortable with um, cases of research participation where the primary motivation is for the financial incentive. And I think at least in principle, we don't necessarily need to worry about that. I think there are a lot of cases where that is a large part of why participation makes sense for someone, but that doesn't mean that they're any less informed. It doesn't mean that their consent is any lower quality. It's just, there are different reasons why the research can make sense for different people. And I mean, one way to see that is there are different motivations that like researchers themselves can have. Some people, say, fresh out of a PhD with bright eyes and bushy tail, are just motivated by contributions to science. And maybe a researcher after a long time gets, it just becomes more of a job. But we don't think that that makes the research unethical just because their motivation has changed. And I think on the participant side as well, it's important not to hold participants to sort of a high and like moralized standard in terms of their own motivations, lest we sort of only recruit people who are willing to help contribute to the growth of knowledge sort of at cost to themselves because we're only going to accept people in the absence of compensation. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense for people to treat compensation as a benefit. I think the easy way to see that is if you don't regard compensation as a benefit, feel free to give me your money. Uh, I think there's this very straightforward and sort of innocent way in which it's a benefit.
And there's a follow-up question also from the audience about coercion and incentives or compensation. The first question was about compensating for barriers to participation. And it's really important that we have, like, for research integrity purposes, that we have a representative sample, including people who have higher barriers or challenges to participate in research. So that kind of financial compensation doesn't seem to even be, we don't have to think about it as an incentive in particular. But one follow-up question a participant has asked is about whether or not there's a distinction between incentives and coercion. Megan, you brought up this idea of coercion as like if we give too much money, maybe that's coercive. So is this something, I mean, I'm interested, Erin, have you been thinking at all about the ways in which financial compensation can be coercive? Is that even possible? Are there is there a maximum that we can think about when it comes to financial compensation to the point where it becomes maybe sometimes people call it an undue inducement or potentially coercive? So walk us through some of these ideas if that's okay with you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting set of issues here. I think one thing that's important is um, to note that just because someone wouldn't do something if they weren't getting the money, that doesn't mean that they're coerced to do it by the money. Most people wouldn't go to their jobs if they weren't getting paid. But this doesn't mean that their sort of employment contracts are null and void because they're coerced contracts. They're valid. It's just that's a condition of someone wanting to do it. So I think the fact that someone wouldn't have participated if they weren't getting money doesn't automatically make it coercive. That being said, I think it's true that, at least in principle, very high levels of compensation, we might worry that they can sort of cloud the reasoning of people. They can um, stop sort of thinking critically about whether the risks are worth it to them at any price. There's some research that suggested that people don't actually do that much, and that people actually retain some reasoning abilities. And my understanding is the research is somewhat divided on that point. What we do see is with really high dollar amounts, people tend to say yes a lot. They enroll a lot. But one reason that might be is because they stop being able to think very clearly. But another reason that might be is because it becomes really rational for them to enroll when there's a lot of money on the line. Yeah, so I think these are worries. I think it's good to keep them in mind when thinking about recruitment strategies and compensation. But I think my personal my belief is that we don't always need to worry as much as we do about especially the coercion side of things.
And Megan, I'm wondering from you if you've like ever thought about compensation or payment as potentially uh, rather than autonomy enhancing, like undermining people's ability to make voluntary decisions about whether or not to participate in research.
Yeah, I think it certainly can be. And I think it's interesting, like our IRB at OSU is very sensitive to that. So for example, if you're putting together recruitment materials like flyers or online media ads, you cannot have the money value be the biggest part on your advertisement. And whenever I'm, asking my undergrad assistants, oh, what are your thoughts on this flyer? They're always saying, oh, make the money part bigger. That's totally what would draw me in. Can't do that. Um, so I think the same with, payment, right? So I agree. It's usually more of a hypothetical case when we're talking about coercion. If we were working on a new medication to help people quit nicotine and it causes awful nausea and weight gain, but we'll pay you $2,000 a week to be in this clinical trial, that could be coercive, right? We're putting people up at something high risk. And especially for, oh, okay, now let's have it be not just general population, but going to the most low income community in Columbus, where we are pretty sure that people will be more motivated and will have an even harder time turning that down. I think that would be a clear issue of coercion. So that's of course a more extreme version. So how do we, find that balance in kind of more normal life? How much can we pay someone for being in a study if we have a great grant budget? How much can we pay them before it becomes coercive?
So let's pivot now to thinking a little bit about risk on the other side. So broadly, I mean, you've already talked about how we can think about risks. And I mean, I guess one question that I have is what sorts of risks can we actually expect research participants to be invited to sign up for? If you think that there are certain limits to the kinds of risks, we can expect them. And one of the things, this is, I'm going to bring in an audience question with this as well. Megan, you mentioned like some of the risks, especially in the pediatric setting when it comes to tobacco research, is these sorts of risks related to getting in trouble from parents or legal ramifications. And so maybe I'll throw this question to you about how you've been thinking about risks, even though this is minimally risky research, often according to the regulations. How should we think about risk and minimize it? And there's certain ways in which there are certain risks that you don't want to expect or ask your participants to take on to participate in the research.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the first thing we can do, of course, is just minimize the risk as much as possible. So, when we're doing studies that are funded by the NIH, they give us a certificate of confidentiality, and that way, That protects us from a lot of legal requirements where we can't be compelled to release data in most situations. We can also make sure that we're doing our best to keep the data protected, and that when we're talking to participants, they're in a place where our conversation can't be overheard. That's a problem a lot, and parents not even meaning to eavesdrop, but they sent their child into the study and we're on Zoom and they're just going to sit there and listen. And, so having clear protocols for that. Minimizing, of course, as much as possible is the first protective step. And then I think just considering, even if something was violated, what's the worst that could happen? We recently actually were doing a study where we're having people attempt to purchase tobacco, and we're seeing if the sellers are checking IDs or not. And there's a lot of discussion about purchase and possession laws in Ohio. So Ohio does not have purchase and possession laws, meaning that a youth who purchases tobacco cannot get in legal trouble. That's not true in all states. In some states, it is illegal to be, possessing or trying to purchase tobacco. However, you can't use a fake ID. That could get someone in legal trouble. So when we're designing this study and we're actually hiring people to do that, we decided, definitely not worth the risk. You are not allowed to use a fake ID. You can use whatever other tactics you usually use to buy tobacco. Do not use an ID, and this is why. So I think, trying to minimize and then thinking about if in that small chance of the risk happening, how bad would it be?
Yeah.
And Erin, have you thought about so I mean, I know that this is the other side of your research, but how should we think about risks? Do you think that there's an upper limit to the kinds of risk we can expect research participants to take on?
Right, good. I do. There are, right. So some people do think that for, say, consenting adults in studies that have the chance to save huge amounts of lives, there is no upper limit on the extent of the risk that consenting adults can be exposed to. I do think there is a limit, although I think it's quite high. One of the reasons being, depending on the type of the research, um, participants themselves, participants in sort of focus groups or patient advocacy groups themselves will explain why they want to undertake quite high risks, and that's because they really believe in the research program and think it's really important. And this is something that's important to them personally. So they think that the risks are, I think this isn't the same as a benefit compensating for a risk, but they have very strongly held values that it's very, very important for them to pursue. And they take those to, at least for their own part, very much rationalize participation, even in the face of very high risks. So for instance, there was maybe 8 years ago, a study, sort of a focus group as part of the Kidney Precision Medicine Project, where there was discussion of kidney biopsy for purely research purposes, which has a risk of death of about 1 in 7,000, which is relatively high. And the potential participants said that they were absolutely happy to take on that level of risk. And I think that is acceptable. My what I've sort of argued is that there's an upper limit because there are some risks that are so severe that we can't give valid, morally transformative consent to them. We can't give the kind of consent that can make it permissible for someone else to expose us to those risks. So really, it's sort of it's an internal limitation on our ability to consent to things rather than something about the risk themselves. The reason being, I think there are, it wouldn't be in our interests to be able to consent to certain levels of risk. But it's still in our interest to be able to consent to very high levels of risk because, again, it allows us to participate in things that are important to us. It allows us to become firefighters or what have you. So I think there are limits for consenting adults, though they're quite high. And I think there are certainly limits for adults who can't consent, children, and they're significantly lower.
So let me jump into communicating risks and benefits. Erin, you sort of mentioned the importance of the informed consent process, and like that's where we sort of counteract therapeutic misconception. Megan, you mentioned like recruitment practices and sort of how we shouldn't like really highlight the amount of money. So I'm interested to hear from both of you a little bit more about how possible benefits and risks can be communicated to research participation to guard against possible therapeutic misconception and potentially other forms of manipulation. One thing that I'm hearing from you, Erin, is this sort of like the altruistic, people want to do something to help people like them, to help their communities, right? But there's like a very different way, like when you sign up to become a firefighter, it's like you are saving lives, right? When you sign up to participate in research, the way in which you're benefiting the community is much more indirect. And I'm wondering if there's like an altruistic misconception that can also come up in the prospect of research participation and research recruitment. So anyway, so maybe let's start with Erin, just sort of thinking through some of these issues related to communication and guarding against manipulation. And then Megan, if you can share also just both the theoretical, but like also how you've been thinking about outreach, community engagement, and communication in a way that minimizes some of these possible risks.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely think there is such a thing as sort of an altruistic misconception. I think there are cases where people's primary motivation, or at least a very important motivation for potentially enrolling in a study, is altruistic, and they're enrolling because they think they're doing some good. They're going to help people by being in the study, when that's either much less true than they think it is, or it's simply not true at all. So you've got cases of studies with essentially no social value because it's a study for a Me Too drug and won't benefit anyone relative to already available medications. You've got cases of research programs that have a very, very low chance of resulting in an intervention that's going to help anyone. It's maybe way too speculative to really expect any individual's contribution by participating to actually materially help to make it any more likely that anyone in the future is going to benefit. So I think those are cases where if researchers don't do a good enough job of communicating sort of the role that this research is supposed to have, if it has a role in contributing to future social value, I think that can lead to social value misconception. I think there's something on the opposite side too, which is where we're worried about influencing people and telling them that there are going to be benefits, or that we're worried about making sort of false promises about the benefits this will have for future patients going forward, that we don't say very much to patients, to participants, about the ways in which being in the study can be a very altruistic thing, and then people sort of don't enroll despite the fact that they would be able to pursue these aims that are important to them. So I think that the thing that's important is sort of explicitly and clearly explaining in what ways participating in this research could be altruistic, could help people in the future, and the ways in which there are sort of limitations on that. I think these sections of informed consent forms are very sparse. I think they could stand to have more detail in them in general, or at least be a bigger part of the consent conversation.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that last comment, I mean, when I look at timing on surveys and time spent, I think many people don't even read the consent forms. So, and that's, I guess, their choice in some ways, or, but I think sometimes, especially when we're consenting minors, we will also just verbally discuss it briefly with them. Even just to explain this is what this document is. And I think that can be really helpful for kind of supplementing that information and talking about the most important points, including like, these are the risks and these are the benefits.
So one question that came from the audience, which I think is touching on something that we haven't talked about yet, and it's sort of thinking about access to interventions, posts, participation in research. So I'm just going to read the question. So it's interesting how much the potential for benefit is considered for enrollment and funding in research. And yet, if there is demonstrated benefit to the participant from the research, it's permissible for the study to end as planned and have that benefit withdrawn. So I'm just wondering how we should think about, yeah, like, does this sort of balancing of risks and benefits for research participation change when the actual research question has been answered and the research has culminated? What are our duties to participants post-research participation? So maybe start with Erin and Megan. I think that thinking a little bit more also about translating some of this research to the community, like how should we really be thinking about our obligations post-research in a way to ensure, yeah, ethical design?
No, I think it's a great question and something worth thinking hard about. I mean, I do think that it's right that there is sort of like, at least by default, a very strong reason for researchers to make plans about how to ensure post-trial access to interventions if it's demonstrated to be effective and safe and things like that. I think one of the things that happens though a lot of the time is there are some pretty big logistical issues that can make it really hard. So, for instance, regulatory issues about getting participants access to the drug or the intervention after the trial. If it's international research, ways of getting the interventions to the people. If the researchers are, say, no longer where they were originally conducting the research. In some types of research where it's really small, sort of startup medical tech companies, they tend to fold a lot of the time in a couple of years, and there's no way to get people access to the intervention afterwards. So I think yes, absolutely, by default, it's very important for researchers to plan and try and find ways of maximizing the chances that they can have sort of get participants continued access after the trial. But I think this is something where there can be a lot of logistical difficulties that get in the way of that, from my understanding.
And
Yeah.
Megan, do you want to just share how you've thought about like how to think about benefits post research participation?
Yeah, and there are certainly people in our College of Public Health who do a better job of this than me. But I think sharing back is, the most basic and best way to do that. Um, letting people know what the findings were. Um, um, letting them know about the publications or what the next steps are. I think that can be really useful. Often we have to de-identify our data once we're all done, and I think that's a great time. Often that's when I try to remember to, okay, before I delete all these emails, I'm going to use them one last time, send, just a quick update to everybody who participated, let them know I'm now deleting your information, but here's how you can get in touch with us, and this is where some info will be posted. I think that's a great opportunity. Um, and this is more of a niche thing, but with tobacco research, we also always send cessation materials. So that's usually just after their participation is over. The study can even still be ongoing, but if we're not contacting them anymore, we always try to find the most recent. I don't do a lot of cessation work myself, but I try to find the most up-to-date resources, recommendations, apps for youth, and then give them, a little something that they could use if they want to.
And I think we have time for one more question. And I mean, both of the presentation and also Megan, your own thoughts have related a lot about the pediatric setting and engaging with youth. And I'm wondering how much this sort of discussion, like how much it is about thinking about the pediatric setting and what we can ask young people to sign up for. Especially thinking about, Erin, this idea of a reasonable person. And then you brought up reasonable parent as the like paradigm of what counts as a reasonable person. And I'm like, just, I would love to hear from Megan, like, when you think about reasonable, like, when you think about, do you think about the parent as sort of the person that's signing up the kid, or do you think about the youth themselves as the research participant that is sort of the one that you're accountable to? I'm just interested to think about the adolescent aspect of this. So maybe Megan, we'll start with you, and then Aaron, you can chime in.
Yeah. So a lot of what I do too, and actually my training in psychology is on adolescent decision making. So yeah, not the most rational decision makers, right? It's fascinating. Um, they are going through a, deliberative process, but it is not the way adults make decisions. And so the weighing of risks and benefits is different. Um, so yeah, that's absolutely something you have to take into account for. It's great that we have parents who also have to um, sign on, and I think that's something that has to definitely be weighed of, um, obviously these are autonomous people. They should be asked of their opinion and what they want to do, but um, yes, I think leaving it just up to adolescents would make them more likely to engage in much riskier studies, especially if the payment is high.
I think, yeah, it's completely agreed. I think there's very good reason why we don't allow adolescent participants to consent for themselves. Um, I and I think, yeah, the one of the other important, I think, things that's important is just because we need the authorization of the parent or other guardian doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to involve the children in as many ways as we can in the decision-making process. I think there are a lot of great ways to sort of assess with them and let them into, if not the, at least a driver's seat in terms of thinking through whether trial participation can be something that's good for them, that makes sense, that they're enthusiastic about, while also not saying that they have free reign to make whatever choice they may like, and that we want the parents to be part of that process too.
So I want to thank the two of you for a really thoughtful conversation. This seems like one place where the regulations are helpful, and this is more about really trying to make sense of what has been said and how to implement what ethical guidance there already is there. So thank you so much, Aaron, for sharing and framing all of these sort of complicated issues. And thank you, Megan, for um, bringing your own sort of perspective and the ways in which you've engaged in ethical practice. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.